of the justice system in America, and we have a great program in store for you today. I'm joined by Noelle Hanrahan to discuss Prison Radio. That's an organization whose mission is to include the voices of incarcerated people in the public debate. And just so everyone knows, our Q&A function is open, so as questions come up for you, for Noelle, drop them in our Q&A function, and I'll do my best to get to them throughout our program. I want to introduce our guest today and then get right into our conversation. We have a lot to discuss. So I'm joined today by Noelle Hanrahan, who is a lawyer, private investigator, and visionary advocate who, over 30 years ago, founded Prison Radio, a groundbreaking multimedia platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of incarcerated individuals across the nation. Today, she continues to co-direct this transformative initiative, which has redefined how we hear and understand the humanity, agency, and lived experiences of those behind bars. Through her work, Noelle has reshaped public discourse on the criminal legal system, producing over 3,500 recordings from more than 100 prison correspondents. Among these are the celebrated voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal, whose writings she helped bring to global audiences in his best-selling book, Live from Death Row, published by Harper Perennial. Her unwavering commitment to elevating incarcerated voices has fundamentally challenged mainstream narratives surrounding mass incarceration. As she poignantly observes, we won't be able to do anything about the culture we live in unless we deal with incarceration. Couldn't agree more. Her work situates mass incarceration at the center of legal and social discourse, exposing it as both a symptom and a driving force of racial capitalism. Noelle, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, I want to jump right in. Can you tell us what is Prison Radio and what was the impetus to create it?
Prison Radio records people in prison. We both go to prisons and do journalistic visits inside prisons, and we use the telephone to give people this form of self-control and self-determination. We don't censor what they say. So we help them craft 3 to 5 minute radio essays in order to get their perspectives out into the public domain and out into the public debate and dialogue. And it really started because I was a broadcast journalist at KPFA Radio doing drive time investigative news work. And we needed to hear first person commentary from the people that were directly affected by a number of issues. And one of them was prisons. And so when you want to understand what's happening, you have to, as a journalist, privilege and make possible the voices of prisoners in that news story. And literally, that's what we did. We made sure that prisoners had the ability to contribute to the news. And I think that any journalist should do that.
For sure. So can you tell us a little bit about this process of establishing correspondence in prison? How are you making and maintaining these relationships?
So we first were doing a number of different documentaries. We did a series about women in prison at Dublin Federal Prison, and many people have heard about that story that has now broken about the sexual abuse cases. So that was one of our very first recordings. And then we did a 13-part series. So we were contextualizing prisons. And then KPFA had me cover the Robert Alton Harris execution in 1992. And we were doing live around the clock broadcasting, and I couldn't find an inmate inside of death row. And so I was disappointed with that work, even though it was award-winning. I searched for someone on death row that could talk to us. And Mumia Abu-Jamal, I'd heard a scratchy recording of his pieces. I read his pieces. I went to Huntington State Prison and recorded him. That really kicked off Prison Radio's ability to reach a lot of prisoners, because Mumia showed us that that was a really dynamic form. And then we started doing 3 to 5 minute radio commentaries and inviting people from other prisons. So right now we have a very active program in Michigan, Women's Huron Valley, very active program at Red Onion State Prison. We have over 47 correspondents who are currently recording from all over the United States. Our senior correspondents are more prolific. Kevin Rashid Johnson, Mumia Abu-Jamal, a number of people, Crystal Clark from Huron Valley. So we have senior correspondents who record at least every week. And then we have a lot of other people who touch base with us. And tell us what's important to them.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you broke a story at a federal prison. Are any of your correspondents in federal prison, or are all of those folks in state prisons?
Right now, there are not any in federal prison, but we have had people in federal prison in the past. And right now we have few in jail, but we have one or two in jails. So the United States prison system is broken up into federal prison, ICE detention, jails, and then state prisons. So there are a lot of opportunities for more people to do broadcasting from inside, but we have a number of people mostly in state prisons.
Interesting. So in those early years of prison radio, what were some of the responses from news outlets, radio stations, when you presented them with reporting from inside prisons?
Ellen Weiss, from All Things Considered, said Mumia Abu-Jamal was one of the best three voices she had ever heard, and that she was privileged to make him a new commentator on NPR and All Things Considered because she was so impressed. And then she waxed on about how at the moment in 1994, we were at the point where our prison systems were exploding. And so we were going from 200,000 people incarcerated to over 1 million, 2 million. So she was in this moment where her news outlet had to understand and had to grapple with imprisonment and mass incarceration. And she was very articulate about it. And she wanted somebody who had chops, who was really good at it. And as many people know in Philadelphia, you can remember Mumia Abu-Jamal broadcasting on a number, dozens of radio stations throughout the Delaware Valley when he was a reporter in 1980, and including WHYY, and also WUHY, the then television station.
So it sounds like the response was pretty positive, at least from one outlet.
I think that any journalist, any true person who's looking to cover a story feels that kind of magic when they know they have something that will add and illuminate and drive and be first person. That is something that people respond to, and that's what Ellen Weiss responded to. But when people hear Mumia's voice and they hear his analysis, they are very responsive. And that is what I was counting on in terms of bringing the voices of prisoners to the general public, that you'll really be able to understand how they're situated. It's part connection, it's part empathy, it's part, these are our brothers, these are our mothers, these are our sisters, these are our cousins. This is not separate from us in any way. The decision to do mass incarceration in a way that no other country on earth does affects our ability to send our kids to preschool. It affects our health care. It means that we can't appropriately treat Hep C or tuberculosis. It means that we privilege racial capitalism. We privilege the incarceration of people of color at a far greater rate than their percentage of the population. We destroyed generations of people throughout Philadelphia. Like Philadelphia, when you are associated with the criminal justice system, you'll know, everybody who has this experience will know it. It's like a glue trap. It's the assembly line of Black and brown bodies through the Juanita Kid Justice Center. This started in Philadelphia, mass incarceration, and Pennsylvania, and so we have a lot to atone for, but it hasn't stopped. And the communities that are affected understand what Rizzo was about. They understand what Ed Rendell was about. They understand Abraham. And we are now populated with the sons of Rizzo. Like, this is not much different. It may be, it's literally not much different. And, I went to law school. I was mentored by a judge, Barbara McDermott. And Barbara told me, we know why the murder conviction rate is plummeting. It's because we told the police they can't chain them to a radiator and beat them. This was not 20 years ago. This was 5 years ago. The culture of policing and the culture that's been created can't be divorced from the legacy of what's been happening to people of color in Philly. And that's either 300 years ago or yesterday. It happens. It is impossible to get yourself out of the system. And the system is incredibly racist, and incredibly retributive. Retributive justice does not work. We need empathy, gracefulness, healing, community.
Well said. And thank you for situating your analysis in Philadelphia. Those examples that you gave are very relevant still. Thank you. So you let us know how news outlets responded to prison radio. I'm also curious how audience responded. For many of us, our first exposure to prison is through popular culture. So how did listeners react to hearing this reporting in a way that wasn't through TVs or movies or sensationalized in that way?
You know, I think that this is a really good moment for us to think about the filter that we just proposed. Many of us have not had this experience, when in fact, the truth is, many of us had the experience. And we have to situate both. We have to situate those people who feel it every day. If you're African American and 19 in Philly, you feel it every single day. And if you are white and privileged and went to Stanford like me, you can pass. And that's something we have to really understand. And we have to own it. Having signs in Mount Airy that says hate doesn't live here is not enough.
Hmm. In your work, I'm curious, you had mentioned earlier how you were reporting from prison, about prisons, and then from prisons. Have you encountered any, censorship or hurdles when working with prison administrations or in, adjacent to them?
So I want to come back to that, but also say that the censorship is endemic in the culture. And so we filed a lawsuit against Governor Corbett, and the state legislature for the Silencing Act, which wanted to take away the pencils and the recording opportunities for anybody in prison in Pennsylvania. So there's been enormous levels of censorship because the state doesn't really want prisoners to be seen as human beings. Like, that's why we have Guantanamo. That's why we have ICE facilities that are closed down or locked down or put away in places you can't see. That's why they don't allow videos of family detention when they separate kids. They really do want to control the narrative.
Mhm.
So we've had extensive censorship by the Fraternal Order of Police, by the local city, state, federal officials. We've resisted the censorship of the prisons. What we do is we follow every prison rule and we advocate for people to have their voices heard. So we don't censor, we don't allow the prison to tell us what people can say. We really do make a point to privilege what people can say. And then we really work hard at getting into prisons and making sure those voices can be heard. It's hard. So I wouldn't say that the majority of the mainstream media, it might take more, but it's worth doing. So I think they should privilege and put their resources there. And you had asked a question that I wanted to pin. So what was that?
I was asking if you had encountered any censorship working next to or with prison administration specifically.
It's a struggle. So the difference between prison radio and Ear Hustle, which is a very famous program, is that Ear Hustle, if you read their book, the last chapter is a dedication to the censor that they worked with. So it's a prison-sponsored narrative. So Uncuffed is a program out of Solano State Prison. And when I met with the producer, I asked him, how do you deal with prisons? Because you're in the prison. And he said, oh, we try to censor ourselves. We try to make sure that we never come up against something the prison wouldn't like. So there are prisons creating their own narratives now, because prison radio, in fact, is ubiquitous. There's a lot of it. And it's very exciting and it's really interesting. But then you also have to ask the resources that are being put behind the prison narratives that are they're creating radio in prison. They have radio stations in prisons. I bet Wetzel, the former DOC secretary, privileged the dog programs. He had the NFL come in to, they have TED Talks in Pennsylvania prisons. That is a result of our work, but it's also approved. You have to audition for the TED Talk. So prison radio is different than that. But it's an exciting time in terms of like we're moving things because we believe that prisoners' voices are critical to empathy, engagement, courage, and freedom. We do believe in abolition. I do not believe mass incarceration is something that's going to serve anyone in this society, not the prisoners and certainly not the rest of us. Everybody gets out. Like, please God, you know, we need to change what we're doing or it's just, yeah. And we're not, there are a lot there, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Oh, it's a great time to be here because it's happening. Prisoners' families are building. Prisoners' families are engaged. Prisoners are engaged. There's a change happening. The Abolitionist Law Center exists. The Amistad Law Project. That didn't exist 12 years ago. It just really kicked off from inside out. Prisoners built this, in part because we had the fourth largest death row, in part because we had some of the largest numbers of people doing life without possibility of parole, over 5,000 people in Pennsylvania, right? A lot from here. And then also we had the most juvenile lifers, people under 18 sentenced to life without possibility of parole. So we have had a tremendous resource inside of people developing their own programs and pushing them out in the families. And then people here are doing it. So it's an incredible moment to see things change. And I do believe things will change.
You said something really interesting there about families building, and I'm curious, a lot of the work that Prison Radio produces, we hear from the correspondents, but are you engaged with any family members and what does that support look like? Can you give us a glimpse into that?
We always ask the people who their people are because we want to give them the links and communicate with them and facilitate some communication if there's an important message, or we just want to be able to know that we can reach somebody if somebody's in dire crisis. If one of our correspondents is at risk inside, we will engage our community, and that's led by their families, like that we were directly in contact. So when I had got the report that there was self-immolations happening at the Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, Western Virginia, by Sheet, I called his mother and his sister, and they provided the documentation to support that he had been transferred to a emergency facility 7 hours away, a burn unit. And they gave us a lot of information, and we then worked with them to understand what was happening in Virginia. And then we worked on that pretty diligently. We still have our eyes on it. Prison radio is tiny but mighty. So we have like 2.5 FTE, one full-time staff person. Like we're tiny, but we really are trying to pay attention and to accompany and amplify the people that our correspondents, people we work with.
You gave some really good examples a moment ago about ways that you come up with against some of the challenges that I asked you about with censorship and working with prison administrations. And I'm curious, just from the other perspective, do you have any really productive working relationships with prison administrations that might surprise our listeners, or any other working relationships with prisons that are productive and I don't know, worthwhile?
So I can mostly speak about it in terms of how I feel like relating to prison guards and prison administrators and prisons. They have the same issues that we do.
Sure.
They're in the same environment. If they are not sociopaths or psychopaths, which only a very tiny percentage of the population is, they have the same concerns. And so I treat every person I meet with when I'm negotiating to get inside with dignity, honesty, transparency, and care, because it just matters. It matters that we work with prisons and prison guards as gracefully as we can, even when there are situations that are dire and there are situations that are life and death, literally life and death. And there are actors that take actions that dramatically impair our ability to get health care, prisoners, and freedom. So I know that there are actions that are being taken that are detrimental, but I'm approaching it with, I have the First Amendment and the Constitution on our side. These people have a right to both legal representation and to be broadcast. And I'm going to fight for those rights, and I'm going to do it really consistently. So I don't have intimate, warm, long-term personal relationships with people who are guards, except my neighbors, because I live in Northeast and they're all prison guards. And we talk about our gardens. And we talk, yeah, so there's a lot of neighbors that are prison guards. And we chat and talk about it, but they're people, they're caring, they're in a situation that is that they shouldn't be in, making decisions that are actually going to hurt people. They have to dehumanize people in order to hurt them. That's just totally distressing. They have to make racial or categorize people in order to, and I think the same is true of foot soldier police, people on the police on the street. I think you can't go through that world without being tainted by it. It's not a job you should do for very long. It's really distressing and hard. So I do think we are at the point of the sword in the same exact issue. They suffer a lot of stress.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. I want to go to the Q&A right now. A couple questions in here. First one is, what has surprised you the most since starting Prison Radio?
Wow, that Mumia Abu-Jamal is not free. I mean, literally, I am gray. I was not gray when I started this. And Mumia has 100 issues, all of which the courts want to suppress because Ed Rendell was a DA and because the courts know that he's sort of a lightning rod, third rail. If they open this Pandora's box, maybe they'll have to be accountable to the torture that has happened throughout the 30 years, 40 years. So I am surprised that Mumia Abu-Jamal has not got a better hearing in Philadelphia common pleas courts, including the court of Lucretia Clemens.
All right, thank you. The questions keep coming in from the Q&A, so I want to keep asking them. Another visitor asked, do you work with any groups that do self-censor and help them understand why it's important not to censor? So how's that work look like between your organization and maybe other organizations that are doing similar work?
I don't. And I think it's just for lack of time. I mean, I meet with producers and we'll talk to them, but it's more jovial. Like, I'm not going to poke a journalist. They should know better. I may encourage, what I do always, whenever I do an investigative story, I take our source folder and I share it with every single journalist, right? So our source folder of the audio, the transcripts, the photos, I shared with Virginia Public Media. I shared with the Richmond Dispatch. I just open it up because I know that it's hard to do these stories. So I would rather support, encourage, and I don't exactly challenge, though I think it's transparent. If you're a journalist, you need to go at it. And I've been told by a lot of journalists that if you go at it hard and you're employed by a journalist organization, that you can be checked. Interesting. Barbara Laker, okay, writes for the Inquirer, wrote a groundbreaking Pulitzer Prize winning book, and the FOP hammered her, right, for a minor indiscretion related to one of the witnesses. Barbara's back. Barbara's on the front page of the Inquirer. God bless Barbara. God bless the Inquirer. God bless journalists who really are at it and who don't fail in the face of attacks from the Fraternal Order of Police, for God's sakes.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I had a question here about legacy media and how legacy media often doesn't do a great job about talking about these issues and sometimes even perpetuates misinformation about the criminal legal system. So, how have larger outlets responded to your work and this model of journalism that's coming from inside prisons?
I think one thing that prison radio can take is that the Marshall Project, the Appeal, ProPublica, they have all worked to get prisoners as part of the story.
Mhm.
I think often we are Al Jazeera, New York Times, the major market organizations do a good job. Democracy Now! Was fantastic, and they're huge. And I would say the Philadelphia Inquirer has great reporters right now, and they're doing excellent work. Maybe not enough. Like I just ordered the New York Times because there are more words in it. So I would like the Philadelphia Inquirer to be 5 times the size.
Yeah, I'm sure they would too. We have a question in the audience from somebody that works in academia, and it's about language, specifically person first language. This is something that comes up at our site all the time. So I'm really interested to hear your answer to this. So basically, this person is asking, in our work, sometimes we're encouraged to use person first language, like incarcerated people, at the expense of not using other words, maybe other words like inmate or prisoner that are actually used by people who are incarcerated. So the question is basically, where do you land on the issue of like person first language and talking about people who are incarcerated?
So I'm 61. So I've been at it for a long time. So I'm evolving in a lot of the language. And I do believe language matters. So I try to encourage myself as much as possible to use people's real names
Mhm.
and to say incarcerated people. So I believe that language is critical. And sometimes as we develop habits, it's hard to kind of undo them. But I think it's really positive and game changing, frankly. Language changes
Yeah.
what people think is possible.
So speaking of change,
Freedom, abolition
right?
has not been privileged, but it will be, and it is becoming our future.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of change and change over time, you mentioned in your bio that you've been at prison radio for some time now. I'm curious, how has the reporting and the work changed as things like the internet and podcasts and tech is moving so quickly? How has your work changed over time to either keep pace or try to accomplish something else?
So I'll just say that Prison Radio has an archive, and we have every single media device that has been created since 1960, likely. So we have Nagra reel to reel. We have MP3s. We have digital audio tapes. We have a whole number of hard drives that came off of early Apples, right? We had an original iPod. So we've been expanding the tools that we use with for decades. We've been trying. One specific example I'll give is many broadcast outlets of the major type would only record prisoners if they could get in-person prison interviews before the first Gulf War because of air quality, because of the sounds, because over the phone, the sounds were not as good.
Mhm.
And you had to have a microphone in front of somebody. What has changed is broadcast quality standards came down just a little bit around the Gulf War because they had to use satellite phones. But it also, the technology got better. So we fast forward through all these years of technology. I was a radio engineer before a lawyer. So before all, and the way I get great Mumia sound is through building racks of equipment, like almost a recording studio. But what has happened right now, which just happened about 6 months ago, is the Apple iPhone OS 16 is a beautiful thing. You can record a prisoner because you can just get a phone call and you can press record on your device, just like this, boop, and you will get a fabulous sound. Fabulous. So all my equipment, about like 4 years ago, I bought like Sound Devices 702, whatever, like amazing equipment. This is just as good. Better, maybe.
Wow, fascinating. Oh, that's really interesting. We have another question from the Q&A, taking us back to something that you said earlier when you were situating kind of our region, Pennsylvania, in this larger story of mass incarceration. This visitor wants to know a little bit more about the origins of mass incarceration in Pennsylvania specifically. Can you elaborate on that for a little bit?
I'm not the best historian, but Walnut Street Prison, first prison in the United States. You can talk about Eastern Penitentiary. I would say that the Quakers are responsible for solitary confinement. They designed it, they believed in it, they thought that it was going to improve the prisoner. It started here, and then it grew and expanded. So Pennsylvania has been at the forefront of incarceration. It's a narrative that is not told in the public media or in our upbringing and education. You'll hear, the birthplace of liberty, the birthplace of religion. You'll hear a lot of rhetoric, but you will not hear that it's the birthplace of mass incarceration. And literally, Governor Ridge rolled out the template for mass incarceration here. So there's a trajectory of Pennsylvanians privileging cutting edge incarceration techniques.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly true. Nothing to add on my end. That was thorough. Okay, so you brought up the iPhone a minute ago. We're talking about how reporting has changed over time. You had mentioned earlier that you follow all the prison's rules when you're doing broadcasting. So I think I already know the answer to this question, but I wanted to know what Prison's radio position is on using contraband cell phones to report in prison. And that's because there is so much footage and reporting coming out from prisons, from incarcerated people on social media using these devices. Is this something that you've come up against or had to experience in your work?
It's not, because we immediately, when we're requested by someone to become a correspondent, we get on their regular phone list. So when I know that somebody is doing something that's sketchy, I always just shut it down, because I don't need to break any prison rules to exercise the First Amendment rights of prisoners. Though, okay, so that said, prison radio has a very clear policy about we just go straight through the front door. And literally, we want our people to come home through the front door. So we are about abolition, but we are also about making sure their voices are heard. I would say that it's really important that those stories get released, that prisoners have the ability to have self-actualization and self-determination. So the fact that there are phones everywhere inside prisons, I think that's a reporting opportunity. If something lands on the internet and there's a clip of audio, fair game.
Yeah. Going back to the Q&A, we've got some really good questions in here. So first of all, Noelle, do you have any correspondence in New York State?
Not right now, but we have.
So this question might not be something that you're able to answer, although we are genuinely interested in your response. You may know that New York State prisons are in a crisis right now where a lot of the correctional officers have gone on strike at 30 plus prisons, and there's lockdowns in those facilities. Do you know anything about whether any voices from the incarcerated people in New York State are coming out? Have you heard or seen anything from those prisons?
I haven't. So I've only heard the stories that the prisoners went on strike, wildcat strikes.
Right.
We would really appreciate anyone calling prison radio. If you know somebody inside, give them my name, Noelle Hanrahan, and my number for the radio station, 415-648-4505, and we'll start a dialogue and we'll get the voices from inside. Because I hear they're being locked down 24/7 because of staffing shortages.
Wow. Okay, great. So if anybody is tuning in, write that number down and direct people to prison radio. Another question from the Q&A. Folks want to know, are your correspondents able to be compensated for the journalistic work that they're doing?
We put money on people's books. It depends on what project we're doing, but yes. Often when we want to do surveys, we pay for postage and phone calls. We try, and it's not going to be a ton of money, but we try and compensate people for the costs. And also we publish. So we published Mumia Abu-Jamal's last 3 books. His most current book is a compilation on city lights So, but we are responsible for making sure that people pay royalties to the people that use the work. So we often place art in publications and we get that. So there'll be ways in which people get compensated for the work that is published.
Very cool. Very cool. So you talked a little bit about what's going on at Red Onion State Prison. I'm not sure if a lot of our visitors would know what's going on. I'd love to hear you share just a little bit about that, how that reporting came to Prison Radio. This is a story that Prison Radio broke. And you would also mention a story at the Women's Federal Prison in Dublin that Prison Radio also broke. So two questions here. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on at Red Onion State Prison and how that journalism is unfolding at Prison Radio? And maybe some other examples of stories that Prison Radio has broke in the past.
So Red Onion, we had heard from one of our senior correspondents, Kevin Rashid Johnson, that an inmate that he was a person in prison that he was in prison with set himself on fire. And they were both in the infirmary. And so we were able to get a call from Ekong, and Ekong told us his story. So that is what first happened. When we did that, people went to the state legislature, they went to the Department of Corrections in Virginia and the governor, and they challenged them to say what's happening at these supermaxes that people are on hunger strike and they're setting themselves on fire. And at first, the prisons denied that it was happening. So we documented it. We called the hospitals that they went to. We worked with local organizers to find other prisoners that would speak out and confirm the story. So we did a lot of investigative reporting on that. And then it broke, and the governor's office issued a press release saying that people had self-immolated. And that contradicted directly what the Virginia, the Red Onion director had said. So then there was a public safety hearing called by the Virginia legislature, and they directed the Office of Inspector General to get out there and use their prison ombudsperson to investigate. So things are moving. Right now, a lot of people in Virginia have passed a limiting solitary confinement bill that's on the governor's desk. So Governor Youngkin has a bill on his desk that had been passed last year as well. He didn't resign it. It was passed this year, and he is being encouraged to sign it. So that's Red Onion State Prison. And I think that Prison Radio's ability to get the voices of prisoners in the mix resulted in the New York Times story, and resulted in the Appeal doing follow-up, and resulted in an hour-long interview with Al Jazeera. And so I think it had a direct and significant impact. Another example of what we have done is when Mumia Abu-Jamal, our most prolific and our senior correspondent, got hepatitis C, we went in and did the investigation that proved with the Abolitionist Law Center, and we filed a lawsuit proving that the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections was refusing to treat anyone with hep C unless they had a very specific condition. And it's called esophageal varius, where your esophagus explodes and you bleed to death. Very, very, very few people were being treated for that. They weren't effectively even diagnosing people with that. And so we forced them to treat Mumia Abu-Jamal with a fast-acting cure. As many people know, a guy in Doylestown helped invent, the hep C fast-acting cure, Sobrifur and others. And we demanded that the prison give it to him as an Eighth Amendment issue. And we got a preliminary injunction from the Third Circuit, and he was given the treatment. And that was used by prisoners across Pennsylvania and everywhere else to get the treatment. So I think that's what we do. We lean in when prisoners who we work with, our correspondents, our colleagues, our friends, our family, when they are in need, we lean in and really work it. We've been targeting and putting the bright white hot spotlight on the Women's Huron Valley, which is the only women's prison in Michigan, which has very severe conditions for women. And so we've gotten some movement with the governor, Whitman. The governor actually called Crystal Clark's defense committee and said, submit a petition for clemency. So we had a guy in Virginia, Rowe, who, when he called us, he called me a couple months ago and he said, I just want to tell you, I got commutation. I'm going to get out very soon, but it was because of prison radio, because two of the three people that were my main support system came because they heard my voice on the radio. So the connections between people, even like books through prison programs are amazing. Pen pals, you have to, like, going back to, are we all affected? We all have to get in there. We have to stand up. This is the moment. This is the moment where we get to stand up and make connection with people inside. If you don't have connection, you should make a connection.
That's a great call to action. Thank you. Only have a couple questions left for you, although we could talk about this all afternoon. What is the future of prison radio? When you think long term, what does it look like? You've told us about all the great things that prison radio has accomplished. I'm sure that that's part of the future as well. But are there other things that you're thinking about when you think about the future?
Wow, we are so tiny. You know, I think it's hard because we're really, really tiny. So if we really need infrastructure and we need more solidness, you know, it's like we're running on a shoestring. So that I would say, what is the future? The future is continuing to provide whatever support we can for the people inside. With the calories that we have, we want to have the maximum impact. So we're going to drill down to really see what we can focus on. When I got my law degree just a few years ago, I went to law school at Rutgers at like 55. When I got that degree, I decided that I was going to use my investigative skills to do innocence cases and medical cases and support of people inside cases. And so I've been doing investigative work because that's what I'm trained in. That's what I'm best at. So I think that is something that we want to do. It's hard though, because the Philadelphia prison system, the court system, Philadelphia court system wants to hold on to people, because if they release the people that should be released, they'll be embarrassed because it's so objectionable. So they're really trying to, you know, innocence projects allow a few people to be released. It's not a few people. It's not a few people. It's 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. It's not 5 a year. It's not 27 for Krasner. It's not 47 for Krasner. It is not 47 people who have spent 30 years in prison for being innocent. It's hundreds. You know, everyone is a disgrace. And so the system in Philadelphia has to genuflect. It has to understand that it has to come to terms with its legacy and its past. Eastern State Penitentiary is part of that. The Roundhouse is part of that, where they torture children into confessing routinely. And the decades of Northeast detectives, we have to come to terms with that. And we have to acknowledge that that's what happened. You can't just brush it away. You can't start anew. Let's just forget the past. In order to come to the present, reconciliation requires truth. And
Yeah, well said.
Philadelphia has something large to get over. And the courts right now want to feel that they have done a great job over the last 30 years. And that is unbelievably not true.
Yeah, well said. When you and I were preparing to have this conversation, we talked about the idea of including the voice of a correspondent, or the perspective of a correspondent. And I think we asked this person a question: why is it important for incarcerated people to report on issues and events taking place inside prisons and jails? And I think you might have an answer for us. I think this would be a great way to end our program. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about the correspondent and then maybe share their answer with us. That's how we'll sign off.
Larry Stromberg is a playwright. He's in SCI Phoenix, and he says, hopefully my work will leave a good legacy and help others in some way overcome the struggles they face in prison and out in society. So that's Larry. Charles Carrington. I want to expose the conditions, abuse, and mistreatment of inmates by officers and a broken system that's rigged and doesn't work. There's no rehabilitation, just mass incarceration. Antoine Walker. It's been a useful resource to put pressure on the DOC when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. It's also connected me with some real allies in the abolition movement. It's given me another approach to fight the DOC and the PIC. And then Charles Carpenter. My hope is to share my experiences through my poetry in hopes to help people in society who may be struggling with the issue that they're relating to in everyday life.
Great answers. Thank you for getting those for us. And please extend our thanks to those folks who shared their answers with us. Well, unfortunately, our time has come to an end, but Noelle, I want to thank you for joining us today and having this amazing conversation. We really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who tuned in virtually and to our marketing team for making everything happen behind the scenes, and to our CEO, Dr. Curry Sotner. And make sure to tune in next month. We'll be talking about women in prisons and jails historically and today. Noelle, thank you again, and we'll see you all next month.
Hey, thank you very much. www.prisonradio.org.